Slowly and piece by piece, we have been exploring and gathering small pieces of a massive puzzle that has driven us in the right direction when searching for answers mainstream scholars have not been able to fully answer. Compelling scientific evidence, found in the last couple of decades, has proven mankind still has a lot to learn about the ancient past. Countless discoveries, made all across the globe, have forced us to question everything about the origin of civilization, ancient cultures, and history in general. Almost every culture has a legend about a great flood, and many of them even mention a comet on a collision course with Earth, just before the disaster. In Egypt, the destruction by the comet was that, according to legends, Sekhmet, the lion-headed goddess and the destroyer of the enemies of the upset about the wickedness of humans that she decided to destroy them all. The Sumerian epic of Gilgamesh also divides time, calling the period before the flood antediluvian, and the time afterwards post-diluvian. During the antediluvian period there were 5 cities in Sumeria, near the Indian Ocean. These were destroyed by a huge flood, some of which were in the Persian Gulf, which was a fertile valley during lower sea levels. There are even more events which could be attributed to the asteroid impact. When an asteroid hits the ocean, water is thrown into the higher atmosphere and falls back to the Earth as rain. In fact, when an asteroid hits firm ground, the ensuing explosion throws huge amounts of matter high up. These are called ejecta, and they come back raining in bits and pieces over vast areas of the land. Ancient stories hint at this explosion. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, a goddess made Gilgamesh, who is sometimes referred to as the world's first superhero, and had a pet lion, but when she wanted him he refused her. Allegedly, this made her so angry that she decided to destroy the city with a rain of fire and stones. Also Gilgamesh epic, the hero of Mesopotamia saw a pillar of black smoke on the horizon before the sky went dark for a week. Afterward, a cyclone pummeled the Fertile Crescent and caused a massive flood. Later, Gilgamesh dresses himself in the skin of a lion, and travels to find a very old survivor of the Great Flood. After a perilous journey over the waters of death, Gilgamesh finally meets the man and asks for the secret to immortality. So, did a comet really cause the Great Flood of ancient times?
In a remote area of northwest Greenland, an international team of scientists has made a stunning discovery. Buried beneath nearly a kilometer of ice, it's an impact crater, 300 meters deep, 31 kilometers wide, much bigger than Washington, D.C., even bigger than Paris, and it's probably one of the youngest large impact craters on Earth. The scientists confirmed the telltale bowl shape and central peaks beneath Hiawatha Glacier. They also found the oldest ice in this crater was actually fairly young by Greenland standards, and had experienced a great disturbance in its flow toward the end of the last ice age. The team then visited the area on foot, and in sediments deposited by a river draining out of the glacier, they found grains of the mineral quartz that showed signs of being physically shocked in a massive impact. Models suggest the asteroid was more than a kilometer wide. The Hiawatha crater is one of the 25 largest known impact craters on Earth, and the first found under any of our planet's ice sheets. Impact could have also occurred when ice already covered Greenland, and it would have instantly vaporized billions of tons of ice and rerouted the flow of ice and water into the ocean. Whenever the impact, life on Earth at the time was profoundly affected.
Even more evidence to support Dr. Brown's theory became available. On March 22, 1998, a group of boys playing basketball in Monahans, Texas, narrowly missed being struck by a 3-pound meteorite that crashed to the ground 40 feet from where they were playing. The police were notified, and 48 hours later, NASA scientists cracked the meteorite open in a cleanroom laboratory. What they discovered inside stunned them all. The meteorites contained salt crystals and liquid water.
The NASA scientists who investigated this meteorite believe it came from an asteroid. That's unlikely, because asteroids in the vacuum of space cannot sustain liquid water, which is required to form salt crystals. It's also too cold and there's too little gravity. Earth is the only body in the solar system that can sustain liquid water on its surface. This demonstrates the enormous power of the subterranean supercritical water, the fountains of the great deep, that launch water and rock fragments into orbit around the sun. These rock fragments are still returning to the Earth as meteorites. Meteorites contain Earth-like material, including many types of living but dormant bacteria. This means that meteorites and their bacteria didn't originate in the vacuum of space. Meteorites are literally tiny chunks of the Earth itself returning home.
Scientists are also scratching their heads over another recent discovery. On the Kola Peninsula in northern Russia, they have created the world's deepest hole, extending to a depth of 7.5 miles. At this depth, what they expected to find was a layer of basalt, Earth's most common type of volcanic rock. What they actually discovered was something entirely different.
The hole didn't reach the basalt underlying the granite continents, but to everyone's surprise, they did reach hot, salty water flowing through crushed granite. Geologists are mystified, but the hydroplate theory provides a simple explanation.
Did the springs of the Great Deep burst the entire Earth, as the Bible says? Hydroplate theory offers us a plausible scientific explanation for how this may have happened.
There's a saying in human history that says what we don't learn from our experiences, we are bound to repeat. In fact, North America was essentially ice. And I said, then what happened? Almost instantly, according to our record, which could have been even in one day, an event happened that raised the temperature so high that the ice started to melt. And the massive amount of ice melting led to the rising of the seas, 400 feet of rise in sea level. Where the massive event changed life on this planet 12,000 years ago, there are several theories trying to how this occurred.
So as we know, of course, there's so much evidence of what the biblical narrative writes about, besides the many different cultures that have obviously a flood story, right? All these things happen simultaneously. We also got a change of culture. Now, today, I'm trying something. I just want to do this because I have a cord today, because for some reason I was getting these crazy lags. So I'll see how this sounds. So this is gonna be a live, just kind of testing out to see how the sound is, and just to have some just a holy conversation today on some things. Now it's interesting because the reason why I'm doing a lot of the early sources is because sometimes you'll hear brothers talk about they lost faith, or they're losing faith in the word, or they don't have evidence of God, things like that. It doesn't make sense, because if you study any type of history, right, especially when looking at the synchronisms of the biblical narrative, there's plenty of synchronisms. The biblical narrative can be highly contested throughout history. Also, the reality of the scientific matter of things, you can obviously see evidence of these things. That's why we're doing a lot of these things that we're doing, because it's actually evidence of. So I'll open up something real fast and talk about the map that we just finished, at least partially. Grab this real fast. All right. So this is that little map we was working on. And we got some interesting little designs here, I believe. So the ones that we see here are going to represent the Paleolithic time. Twos are going to represent the Mesolithic time frame. And the threes, we're going to keep working our way until we get all the way until we get to about, I say, Iron Age, about the Iron Age. Because the Iron Age is where we get most of the events of the Israelites and the major parts of the biblical story. So it's nice to see a picture of where was Japheth lines, where was Shem's lines, and where is Ham's line. So tomorrow, I have a note that I'm preparing. It's not ready yet to go over. I still got some meat I want to grab for it, but I got an interesting note. I just show a quick view of it, what I'm doing tomorrow, because this, y'all willing, the live that I set, I think it's Sunday, it's gonna be, we're gonna do the E group. We're gonna put the E group on the chart. But here's a note I got. I'm gonna talk about. We're gonna do a little talk on this. We're gonna talk about the origins of the A and B group. We're gonna talk about where they come from. It's a couple interesting things. So got a little note set aside for some things that we're gonna talk about. Right? It's still, I got a few more pieces. Gotta connect a few more pieces, and I'm gonna set that aside. So we'll touch on that later on. We'll touch on that later on. Just want to let it get a good sound, hear the sound a little bit of what's going on, because I want to make sure I don't got no lags or anything like that. All right. And if anyone got any questions real fast while I'm up, let me know. Since I really like doing nothing, I'll just drop a link in the description or in the chat. Just let me know. Otherwise, I'm just doing a quick scan through on a couple different things. Quick scan through, nothing too big today. In fact, this is actually what I'm gonna show today, since I want to take a day just to concentrate on this. I want to get a full picture. I want you to get a full picture on what is actually a Neanderthal, what is a Denisovan, what is a modern human, all those things. They're essentially just humans, that they all come from one group. I'm going to show you from one source real fast. So they just say a genomic study reveals how basically how humans emerge, how modern humans emerge. It says we carry genes from our ancestors' encounters with ancient people like the Neanderthals, but the Neanderthals already carried some modern human genes from even earlier encounters with vanished groups. So it's kind of interesting, because what it's going to express is going to express basically what I've been expressing for a long time, that there's no separate branches of humans, that all humans ultimately link to one node, that they come from one group, they come from Adam, ultimate root. But let me go to something and I'll let you hear it. You know, I can read this. This is a really interesting read, just an article talking about a very interesting topic. Basically going to be quoting a couple different scientific articles that's kind of interesting, and getting a couple different quotes, geneticists, that I think is really interesting. So I'll let this play through, and then let me know.
Welcome to Quanta Magazine's podcast. Each episode, we bring you stories about developments in science and mathematics. I'm Susan Vallet. Humans today are mosaics. Our genomes are rich tapestries of interwoven ancestries. And with every fossil discovered and every DNA analysis performed, the story gets more complex. We're the sole survivors of the genus Homo. We harbor genetic fragments from other closely related but long extinct lineages. Modern humans are the products of a sprawling history of shifts and dispersals, separations and reunions. It's a history characterized by far more diversity, movement, and mixture than seemed imaginable a mere decade ago. But it's one thing to say that Neanderthals interbred with the ancestors of modern Europeans, or that the recently discovered Denisovans interbred with some older mystery group, or that they all interbred with each other. It's another to provide concrete details about when and where those couplings occurred. Aylwin Scally is an evolutionary geneticist at the University of Cambridge.
We've got this picture where these events are happening all over the place. So we've got lots and lots of different structured human populations in various parts of the world, most of whose descendants no longer exist today. They're extinct in some formal sense. It's kind of funny. We're building up this story about lots of subpopulations around the world and lots of integration and lots of gene flow. And that seems to be quite persuasive. But it's very hard for us to pin down any particular single event and say, yeah, that we're really confident that particular one happened, unless we have ancient DNA. Ancient DNA really is the most powerful tool in all of this.
The events that do get pinned down tend to be relatively recent. They start with the migration of modern humans out of Africa 60,000 years ago. During that time, humans interacted with hominin relatives like the Neanderthals and Denisovans they met along the way. Evidence for interbreeding before then has largely been absent. Now that's starting to change. Joshua Akey is a professor of genomics at the Louis Sigler Institute for Integrative Genomics at Princeton University. He says in part because of greater computational power, we're starting to see the next wave of developing methods for studying these things. He says that's allowing scientists to start making new inferences from the data. Scientists are looking further back in time and uncovering evolutionary relationships in unprecedented detail. Their findings are complicating the narrative of human history and rescuing some formerly missing chapters from obscurity. Clues are emerging about the unexpected influence of gene flow from ancient hominins on modern human populations before humans left Africa. Some researchers are even identifying the genetic contributions modern humans might have made to those other lineages. It's a complete reversal of the usual scientific focus. Confusing and intertwined as these many effects can be, all of them shaped humanity as we know it. When researchers first recovered DNA from Neanderthal bones, the available techniques for making sense of it were powerful, but relatively simple. Scientists compared ancient and modern sequences, tallied up shared sites and mutations, and conducted bulk statistical analyses. That's how they discovered in 2010 that Neanderthal DNA makes up about 2% of the genome of people today of non-African descent. It's a result of interbreeding throughout Eurasia, beginning 50,000 to 60,000 years ago. That's also how they discovered that Denisovan DNA makes up approximately 3% of the genome of people of Papua New Guinea and Australia. John Hawks, a paleoanthropologist at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, says in the first stages of studying ancient DNA, scientists used a simple approach.
But that kind of very simple approach isn't very good at sorting out the complexity of that process. Like, when did this happen? How much was it? Was there bidirectional flow? Did sometimes the ancestors of modern people contribute to these ancient populations? As more sophisticated methods are introduced, people are testing those more complex things.
Population geneticists could backtrack through the DNA data to identify common ancestors from hundreds of thousands of years ago, and they could detect recent incidents of gene flow from the past few tens of thousands of years. But Hawks says that involves looking at a very recent process, gene flow from Neanderthals, and looking at ancient common ancestors.
Finding evidence for events in between those is difficult because what you're saying is it's old enough not to be recent, but it's young enough not to be ancient. and that actually takes an extra trick, right? We need some way to really be more accurate about this pattern. And that's why these new approaches have some promise, because that's what they're doing.
More recent events smear their footprints over the older ones. The DNA sequences left behind from those older events are so fragmented and mutated that they're difficult to recognize and even more difficult to label with a date and location. Adam Siepel is a quantitative biologist at Cold Spring Harbor Laboratory in New York. He worked with colleagues Melissa Hubis and Amy Williams, both of Cornell, to focus on such gaps in the narrative. They're really interested in looking for signs of gene flow from modern humans into Neanderthals. That flow of genetic information is harder to study than the reverse, not only because of how long ago it happened, but also because there are fewer genomes to refer to. Think of all the present-day genomes at researchers' disposal versus the handful of Neanderthal genomes left intact, or the single genome recovered from Denisovan remains. The challenge again prompted the need for new methods. Using one such new technique, first in 2016 and then again in a study published in PLOS Genetics this month, Siepel and his colleagues found that around 3% of Neanderthal DNA, and possibly as much as 6%, came from modern humans who mated with the Neanderthals more than 200,000 years ago. The same group that gave rise to modern humans throughout the world also furnished Neanderthals with more DNA than the Neanderthals would later give them. Siepel says that starts to raise a question.
It's a high enough fraction that maybe when you analyze the Neanderthal genome, you should explicitly mask out or remove those regions that are derived from modern humans, because otherwise you might start to get a confusing story from your analysis of the Neanderthal genome. Basically, you think you're just looking at a Neanderthal, but you're actually looking at a mixture of a Neanderthal and a modern human.
And so Neanderthals were part African. That's cool.
That's paleoanthropologist John Hawks.
But to say that, no, this could be as high as 6% is saying, that's like saying 6% of the cars on the road that you see are red, but somehow you never noticed any red cars. That's like, you ought to notice that. and if our data so far have not noticed that kind of thing, it tells us that there's a lot left for us to find that we haven't yet found the way to accurately quantify.
But more advanced techniques may change that. The finding also adds to the already compelling body of evidence that there were multiple migrations of modern humans out of Africa, stretching back hundreds of thousands of years. Modern humans were thought to have evolved in Africa after the departure of Neanderthals and Denisovans, and to have remained on the continent until their well-known out-of-Africa diaspora 60,000 years ago. But recently, fossil evidence has indicated otherwise. A couple of years ago, scientists reported dating a human jawbone found in Israel to 180,000 years ago. A skull fragment found in Greece is even older. Both suggest there were earlier human migrations out of Africa than previously thought. In fact, with the piece of skull fragment, archaeologists may have stumbled across a possible member of the long-ago Exodus and his team inferred in their genomic study. The fauna originally was classified as Neanderthal when it was unearthed in the 1970s. But last year, paleoanthropologist Carvati of the University of Tübingen and her colleagues analyzed it again. Structurally, it looked somewhat like a modern human skull, but it was estimated to be about 210,000 years old. That's supposedly too old to be modern at that location. But because the structural similarities to modern skulls show up in reconstructive models of the Greek fossil, the conclusion is controversial and will probably continue to be until DNA can be recovered for a genetic study to confirm it. Now, DNA evidence seems to back up this revised migration narrative as well. Here's Aylwyn Scally.
In some ways, for people coming outside, and I'm one of those because geneticists haven't necessarily had much to say about this previously, it seems quite natural to assume that human populations and evolution were just as messy 200,000 years ago and just as subdivided and structured into different varieties and different groups and populations just as much then as they are today. There probably was also a lot of genetic diversity and perhaps cultural diversity. That's what one is suggesting. Now, that's obviously, that's a sort of a story that I'm painting there or telling, and it's a conjecture. That's not something that we can directly say, but it's where this is heading. It certainly makes it harder to argue that there was some sort of special evolutionary event or genetic event that triggered the evolution of humans as we know them or as we find them in the fossil record 100,000 years ago or as they come into Europe.
Humans have been continuously evolving through the mixing of varied populations for hundreds of thousands of years. Paleoanthropologist John Hawkes says it's exciting to see this.
Because it's like, okay, now we can say, wow, Neanderthals got stuff from some Africans. The African humans were contributing to these Neanderthal populations. We know something about the magnitude of that. It's in fact a little more than recent people have probably got from Neanderthals. And that's telling us, this is not a weird one-off. This is actually a continuing interaction.
But here's what's interesting. The only migration that seems to have left modern human descendants in Europe and Asia was the one from 60,000 years ago. The groups that migrated earlier apparently all died out or got absorbed into Neanderthal or other ancient populations. Scally says that's what the evidence we have available today points to.
If there were earlier events, perhaps like this one in Greece and elsewhere, they left essentially no ancestry or negligible ancestry in us today. Almost none of our genomes and none of our genealogies descend from those individuals, at least not directly. It might be actually that this via Neanderthal legacy, it might be the only sort of descendants that those people had.
Plus, when the Neanderthals then interbred with modern humans during later migrations, perhaps some of that DNA got mixed back into the modern human genome, embedding older signals of Homo sapiens history into the genetic material of individuals alive today. According to Siepel's analysis, that sort of nested mixing seems to have been exactly what happened with the Denisovans. When the team looked at the Denisovan genome, they found fragments of DNA in it from an even earlier hominin, vestiges of some population whose own genome has not been found or sequenced. Siepel says it might have been Homo erectus, which split off from the ancestors of modern humans and spread across Eurasia about 1 million years ago.
We know that Homo erectus lived in Asia and across Eurasia, so it's possible that Homo erectus interacted with and interbred with these other archaic hominins, the Denisova, and that these segments that we're finding in Denisova actually trace back to Homo erectus. So we identified these segments, Melissa identified these segments in the Denisovan genome and attempted to say something about how much of the genome they accounted for and this sort of thing. It's really at the limits of the detection power.
This unidentified group made up only about 1% of the Denisovan genome. But that's where Siepel says the story gets a little more complicated.
Because the Denisovan genome has also interbred with modern humans and passed on Denisovan DNA to modern human populations, particularly in Southeast Asia, Papua New Guinea, and somewhat also in East Asia. It turns out that some of those very ancient fragments that we hypothesize came from Homo erectus have actually been passed on to modern humans. So there's a small set of these extremely divergent DNA sequences that are present in modern humans, and if our analysis is correct, they would have been passed through 2 interbreeding events, first from Homo erectus to Denisova, and then from Denisova to modern humans.
Genomics professor Joshua Akey says basically the lesson is that when populations meet, they mix. Serena Tucci, a postdoctoral researcher in Akey's lab, says the work shows there's more need for more sophisticated computational approaches to make inferences about our past. In Siepel's case, that meant testing a vast number of hypotheses by inferring the branching inheritance patterns of various genes. Other scientists are starting to rely on different probabilistic approaches. Akey says as computation power becomes more sophisticated, these methods will become more and more accessible and feasible to do. He says these models work well because they use all of the features of the data. Siepel now hopes to apply his approach to other elusive aspects of history. He's particularly interested in prehistoric population dynamics on the African continent. How did ancient genetic mixing events affect modern African genomes? That hasn't been studied very much. But a pair of researchers reported in PLOS Genetics that humans in Africa interbred with another ancient hominin group, both before and after the ancestors of European and Asian populations split off and migrated away. By the scientists' estimates, DNA from that unknown group somewhere between 4 to 8% of modern human ancestry. That said, Siepel's technique could perhaps provide deeper insights into those statistics and what they mean. For example, researchers studying how that ancient DNA made its way out of Africa into other populations might follow its trail to roughly map out migrations we don't know about yet. Chris Stringer is an anthropologist at the Natural History Museum in London and a member of the research team that studied the Greek fossil.
I think Africa is one of the other areas which is going to give a lot more data in the future, because it does look like sub-Saharan Africans have got a similar level of integration, not from Neanderthals, not from Denisovans, but from some other kind of ancient human. And of course, the question is, who is that? Was there even more than one?
Quantitative biologist Adam Siepel is using his algorithm to also look for signs of natural selection acting on these DNA sequences. Were ancient hominins any better or worse off for carrying more genes from modern ones? So far, his team has found no evidence for either positive or negative selection in the flow of genes from modern humans into Neanderthals 200,000 years ago. John Hawkes ponders what that means.
If speciation were ongoing, I'd expect that there would be bad genes more often than good genes when mixture's happening. Most of this gene flow that's happening is not happening for reasons of selection, and it's not impeded by selection. It's just a signature of populations in contact. That does suggest that the process that we're seeing is not being driven by speciation. And maybe that's a hint that the process of inheritance, that gene flow is not being mediated by the fact that these are speciating. What it suggests is maybe Neanderthals actually are us. Different as they are, maybe they're just another version of us.
That's something that can be studied in other species as well. Siepel has already started to look into the forces at work in the speciation of certain birds. Here's evolutionary geneticist Aylwin Scally again.
In many cases, what we should be doing is taking these more complicated models that we have now developed for humans, this messy picture with lots of reticulation. We want to be taking that and actually applying that to other species and saying, this may actually be how these species diverged, so that today we see two different species of bird or whatever, or butterfly or monkey. Well, 6 million years ago when they diverged, maybe it was a much more jumbled up, messy picture, and maybe a million years later there was some gene flow event like the ones we see in humans.
Of course, inferring these population histories is a complicated process. Evolution genomics researcher Joshua Akey says there's a limit to what genomics can infer. Sometimes alternative historical scenarios have basically the same effects on the genomic record. And in those situations, even better methods of genetic analysis will be hard-pressed to squeeze answers out of the data. Still, Akey says we're a long way off from reaching that limit. Scally agrees.
There is a amount of information in human studies, so there is plenty of stuff still for us to discover.
All right, shalom, family. So just a quick summary of just looking at. So this is what we were looking at. Again, this was the highlight of it. Genomic studies reveal, right? Just talking about the emergence of modern humans, right? It says this: we carry genes from our ancestors, right? From our ancestors' encounters with ancient people like the said Neanderthals. But the Neanderthals, this is what a lot of people have to understand, because a lot of people, they refer, when you notice, if you ever seen how they related humans to Neanderthals, well, guess what? The same way they relate humans to Neanderthals is the same way they can relate Neanderthals to humans, because they're not connecting them 100% by birth line. They're not saying a Neanderthal brings birth to a modern human, but they're checking their what is basically like autosomals or like certain connections, showing that they are human. It's basically showing that these are human. That's why it says, but Neanderthals already carry some modern human genes from even earlier encounters with vanished people. And that's why we did that live when we was talking about how the origins of human, if you look at the ancient root, the oldest finds that we have found, right? The actual Y chromosome atom, you can find out that that same Y chromosome atom also makes the Neanderthal lineage. That the Y chromosome atom that was found is actually an ancient line, not A00, but more older than that one. Is a more older line that's important to talk about. But real fast, I just point this out because if someone's familiar with genetics, they're probably thinking already that, well, A00 is the oldest one. It has to make everyone. It seems like the A groups might be older, right? But they're actually not. That was part of when they had looked at the whole design of the. If you ever seen this paper, if you never seen this paper, you got to see this paper. It was by a geneticist that looked at the Y chromosome, and what they did was they took a lot of certain genetics and was to see if they can. This is the thing about science. If something is science, you can always reconstruct it. But one geneticist and others who've seen this realize that you cannot reconstruct the out of Africa concept. That just know that people did not only they confined to Africa because they have mixtures with what is called an ancient humanoid called Homo erectus, which we talked about before. He actually comes from a line called Homo auguster, which came from, we got some evidence of him from the Australian Museum that he was actually outside of Africa. They also have ties with Neanderthals and Denisovans, modern humans. So if they have ties to Neanderthals, Denisovans, Homo erectus, Homo auguster, obviously, because the spreading out from that, then why would they only be confined? Why would modern humans only be confined to Africa? That's the concept to understand. And also, they don't even branch out that way. You can't confine lineages only to A groups, that everyone didn't come from an A group. That's actually what this study was. Reconstruction of out of Africa not having enough proof. It was a very important paper that actually talked about the mutation rate, a couple things like that. Obviously, going over Neanderthals and Denisovans brings light to those things as well. But let me read you something that he says right here. This is what he says. Speaking of one of these things, let me actually go to one right here. Let me see if I could just point it out on here, because let me see if I can find it. I want to show you something on this directly. Maybe I can find it. Let's just point out this one. That's one what we work for now. This talks about the origin, like the start of the branches. It says it starts, rather continues the evolutionary trunk of human Y chromosome in the upper left hand side of the tree and immediately reaches the first fork at A0T. It just talks about its name change. We see a split of A0T into haplogroup A1B, right? Just says now it's A0, whatnot. But this is what they say. In other words, we see a departure of a first African branch, A0, from the main tree. None of the non-African groups, that's anyone that comes from CT, haplogroup CT among them, descend from that departed haplogroup, A0. That's very important. That's very important. That's why it just goes on and it talks about every one of the SNPs, and it says that none of the CT groups come from A groups. And if you know what comes from CT, you got to note that CT makes CT makes D and E and CF groups, where from F-M89 comes your GHIJK, HIJK, IJK, and your IJ makes your I groups. And your K, right, IJK makes a K-M9 that makes basically your L and T and MSNOP QR groups. That's actually going to come from one family. But that's what they if those groups actually make each other like that. And they found no, they don't. That's why what this was an interesting article that came out, had a lot of different geneticists giving their understanding of these things, that actually humans show a multiple origin, that humans actually will come from different places around, because we don't have the fossils of the said oldest humans, but we have some old ancient humans, so we can get a good understanding of these things. And they just show that there obviously a lot of these breeds that people would say were different species or different whole different branches might be more similar than people think. That's why it says, but it's one thing to say that Neanderthals interbred with the ancestors of modern Europeans, or that the recently discovered Denisovan interbred with some older mysterious group, or that they all interbred with each other. So that's one thing. That's one thing to say that. It's another to provide concrete details about when and where these coupling occurred. So it's, now remember, it's one thing to say it in conclusion, like say, oh, they must have bred, they must have interbred. But it's another thing to show the hard evidence of those things, right? And that's why I say we got this picture where these events are happening all over the place. All over the place, not just in one place. They're meeting all over the place, right? And that's why I was showing you last time when we was looking at these things, right? Because this has to do with our world or our human origin, right? The truth of these things, right? Whole reality that we live was an orchestrated lie. They say that the world was such a clean illustration that everything came out of this area of Africa. But that wasn't true. That rather, this picture that you're seeing here is actually the evidences of where humans were found, making with these ancient humanoids, Denisovans, Neanderthals, and these are modern Y DNA. Right over here, this is going to be an A group, over A groups that mix over here. You're going to see some C groups that's mixing over here. You're going to see some of the groups that make the R groups and other groups over here, and other groups around. These groups are actually very important to note, because we're talking the earliest finds of humans, the earliest finds. Now, I'm not talking SNP mutation. If they talk SNPs, the ages increase from SNPs, counting SNPs and mutations. But we're talking fossils. This is actually talking fossils, found, confirmed fossils that are found around the world that contest to its story. Just for example, let's just for an example of one of those reads real fast that we're talking about, because that's what they're saying. They're saying that humans didn't just start in Africa; they started all over the place. Something from just last year, published 14, right? The undetectable apology of Homo sapiens just anchored the origin of modern humans in Eurasia. Now, this was just recently. Remember, this was just recently. They're saying that basically looking at the genetics is actually anchoring the origins of modern humans in Eurasia, right? Is anchoring the origins of modern humans in Eurasia. And they're talking about basically Y-DNA, mtDNA, the whole thing. Just to point out an example here. So they're going to obviously talk about the Cochin, and that's basically modern people today and things like that. And remember, they was talking about that they have some connections to Homo erectus and whatnot. But you can have two different lineages that you see here. This will be basically your Neanderthal branch, and this will be your Denisovan branch. So they say basically they have links coming from that earlier human, what they call Homo erectus, and basically that individual, long story short, has ties to the people of Africa. And what's interesting about that is that I talked about this before, that Homo erectus and obviously these earlier lineages are found outside of Africa. And that means that by this autosomal connection in the Cochin in these groups, that means they had interactions at an early stage. This is what they called a ghost population that we were talking about before, that was found in the West Africans. This was a very ancient genetic mixture that they were looking at, that they would talk about when they said previous genetic research shows that our species interbred with both Neanderthal and Denisovan, with modern human populations outside of Africa still carrying DNA from both. But while there is obviously, when they talk about the record and everything, they talk about the newly identified ghost population. They just talk about how it's really interesting, pretty much. They got some information that's building up, right? It's still building up, that's working its way up into what they have today, and until it's to its fullness, to it's at its full stage, whatnot. Just gonna click one more note here just to have a two-source understanding here. Here's something, if I recall, is a little back. It's going to be the divergence of Neanderthal and modern human Y chromosomes. And I'll talk about this before when I was mentioning that about that ancient A00 group, when they was talking about basically right here, it says, we estimate that the time of the most recent common ancestor of Neanderthal and modern human Y chromosomes, they say is such a high year, right? They say in between 400,000 and 800,000, pretty much, like 500,000, pretty much. Obviously, these are exaggerated, but this is just letting you know that this is origin. We're talking roots of modern humans, where they come from, where they start out at. It says, it just talks about, obviously, it's longer. When they talk about how they're looking at these ages of these groups, they know that it goes way, way back to the origins of humans. And it's basically telling us that humans started outside of the areas of Africa and also started all over. Now, there will probably be possibility of finding some humans started in Africa, as well as finding people that start outside of Africa. And that's what they're actually finding, is that they're finding these lineages that basically moved into different areas all around. And they found out that obviously it was one of those things that basically gives some interesting understandings to some things, gives some very interesting understandings to some things. That's why they was connecting those early humans, and they're saying that they have obviously connections to those groups. As it says right here, as a parent, the evolution is continuous and undirectable. I got this word twisted. Undirected. I got it twisted. Basically, it's moving through the entire tree from the oldest to the most recent. Is basically Homo sapiens sapien, right? Divergent as represented by the African Mambuti and basically Cochin and Eurasian Lud. So you can get a good understanding of what's going on here and its connection of humans that are basically going to have a said connection to what they call Neanderthals and Denisovans and all those things. So obviously, like they were saying before, Neanderthals and Denisovans don't make these lineages, but they're related. They're going to be related at some ultimate root. Some ultimate root, they're related at some ultimate root. And that's going to be important to note, because when you think about it and understand that even before Ham, Shem, and Japheth existed, we would have sons of Seth and sons of Cain moving around throughout the land. But we did know that there's a flood story that happened in many of the nations of the world that had literature wrote down that there was a flood event. And this was all across the whole world. And we get the same understanding of the fact that this event could happen by the bottleneck evidence of Y chromosomes and the Younger Dryas event. So a reset of civilization was definitely something that happened. And that's why they talk about a civilization that started to grow after the said ice age. So that's important. So the population that proceeded after such of a massive event that they call Younger Dryas, that became the lineages that we see living today only. And all other ancient lineages are wiped out. All other ancient lineages will be wiped out. but we do see that they would have connections to ancient humans, right? They didn't just pop up out of nowhere. They would come from someone, right? They got to come from some ancient human. Now they're going to give whatever name they want to whatever those humans are, they find them. But we do know that they're going to come from a Eurasian lineage. A Eurasian lineage is where they're coming from. They're actually coming from Eurasia. It's actually important that they're actually branching off from a Eurasian lineage. That basically makes it important to understand what we're seeing in the world today, pretty much. Long story short. So that's why, I have some information I'm going to go over on him that has some very interesting information, I think. And it's going to be enlightening. I'm going to also connect it with the African linguistics, as actually Ham does have ancient ties to the oldest African languages. And it's not the DE groups, right? That's very important because we got reports telling us that the E group, right, was not in the areas of Africa, of deep West Africa or South Africa, until about, said, 3,000 years ago. And that's about 1,000 BC. So only about 1,000 BC did they start making their way into the areas of deeper Africa. That's very important to know, that when you think about West Africa or the lower parts of Africa, think about West Africa, like where you see the grass, all this grass down here, there's no found outside of grass. You see this grass here? There's no E found in this lower area of Africa or down here. In times past 3 ago, owned by another group that we're going to talk about. Owned by another group that dominated this area, but they had an early battle with the Natufi, that was the Levantan groups. A group that was in this area had an early battle with Natufian groups. I'm talking early. I'm talking right after the Younger Dryas event. We're going to talk about it. And they separated, right? These were separate lines. But one was the ruling class of Africa, and one was the ruling class over here. But something happened that caused them to constantly move about, move downwards, and ruled this area to making the land one that was under here. We'll talk about it. We'll talk about what happened. And these are going to be real parts to talk about these things. The same group that ruled down here, before down here, even though it was down here the earliest. It was down here the earliest. I'm talking 10,000 BC, and these are exaggerated times, right? But we're talking after the Younger Dryas, just like we did when we looked at the Jarwal people of the people of Japan, right? The ancient groups that went over there by the time of the Younger Dryas, even to the Natufians that would have settled in the areas of the Levant that we talked about was after the Younger Dryas. This group would be a group that was settled early in the area of Africa, the Younger Dryas event. And also that same group, before that Africa, I'm going to up here, fulfilling as the biblical said, that Ham, Shem, and Japheth was basically around each other, and then Ham called them down. When I say Ham, I'm talking Nimrod, son of Cush, called them down to Shinar, which is actually going to be Babylon, right? So you think Shinar, which is ancient Shinar, you can see right here, the understanding. A lot of historical texts for Shinar and what is Shinar and whatnot is basically a region, obviously in Mesopotamia, but Shinar is going to be basically ancient Babylon. It's the earliest place that's spoken of when you think Shinar is like Sumer and whatnot. So having connections to ancient areas of Mesopotamia, but it's actually Babylonia. Is really what it is. It's Babylon. That's really what it is that it's the land of Babylon. And that's what's important is the history behind it, what goes on there, and that there's a quick replacement. When the time of Ham rules over the nations, his time of ruling the nations isn't established anymore. Ham does his power over those areas isn't as dominant as it was before the fall of Babel. After the fall of Babel, the whole power, everything was shuffled. The power tide moved, right? Everything was shuffled and a new power rose up. And then the nations were kind of having the same name, but having a change of a list that rules in that area. So very important to talk about. And we'll go over those things and some things. So y'all willing, tomorrow, everything sounds okay today, right? Because I don't like how we get those skipping and everything. But tomorrow, I got a note to go over, and it's not finished yet. But I want to quickly show you a little summary of it. It got some things that talk about the Neanderthals and ancient humanoid things and whatnot. And it's going to talk about basically how they come together with modern humans. And we're going to talk about where they meet those modern humans, which is in the Chaz Republic. And I'm going to show you in the Chaz Republic that we got A groups there. And those A groups in the Chaz Republic and as other places are actually going to be African. It's actually going to be very interesting. Just to read a quick quote. I'm not going to get into it right now, but it just talks about some interesting things. It says, it's interesting that the most similar skulls in our sample come from recent Africans on the one hand, and on the other hand, from those modern humans that lived in Europe between 20 to 30,000 years ago. For instance, this one that we're going to talk about when we get a little conversation and some things and whatnot. We're going to talk about some things, some interesting things that is going to be edifying for people that want to know who's him. Because these lineages, these monophyletic families, they're just picking anyone and making them anyone him. And they're just like, must be him because they're black. But what you might see might surprise you. So Helm is most of the time dark skin, but we actually can find him as well. Helm is not a skin color. Helm is going to be a bloodline, right? So we got to look at blood. We got to look more deeper than just outer coating. We got to look inner coating, right? It's the inside that counts. Even deeper than that, though. So it's going to be some interesting stuff. I'm just going to, break some stuff down. It's going to be some things that maybe even you never even seen before, but some people seen it. It's going to be, here's a highlight. Almost nothing is known about the period between 11 to 8,000 BP before present. I'm going to show you that we do got some stuff that's known. But our next information just talks about, they just talk about some things that about some late Paleolithic stuff and whatnot in this time, which is always, is very important to remember this. Up to millions and millions of years ago, up to about 11 BC, 11, 12 BC, that's the Paleolithic time frame, right? Paleolithic time frame is up to millions and millions of years ago, up to 11, 12 BC. That's the Younger Dryas, right? Isn't that convenient? Paleolithic ends about the Younger Dryas. So that's something to take note of, that the Paleolithic time frame with all your Neanderthals and Denisovans, all your ancient humanoids and stuff, all exist in your Paleolithic time frame. And guess what? They're all wiped out soon as the Mesolithic comes. They're all wiped out soon as the Mesolithic comes. Isn't that convenient? That after the Younger Dryas, a said wipeout event, we get a total wipeout of a whole ancient species, and all we got is modern people today. And these lines that we have today can go into these three supergroups, which is A and B, D and E, and CF groups. And from those groups, the whole world is populated. And that's what we see today. Every single person every male comes from those groups. But then, we talk about the females and everything, So this little map, one day I'm going to set a day just to maybe plot down some mtDNA, right? Some highlight areas of where the roots of mtDNA, the oldest fossils at least, that we can find. And as always, what I'm trying to always do is get a lot of intellectual individuals involved. So if I miss something, like an actual source, you can always throw it on there, because I allow all links and whatnot and all comments. So I can look at that and consider it and maybe throw it on these things. But from what I've seen, right, everything of Japheth so far is valid. Everything of Japheth so far, what we're seeing is valid. We're seeing Japheth would have ruled the north, would have stretched early across the seas, and would have settled in these places. But this Sunday, we're going to put Japheth, we're going to put Shem on the map. And I'm going to show you that these DE groups, as we know, D settles obviously in the lands of Japan. We're going to note, as we went over the D group before with the Jarwa people that had that cord impressed, right, pottery culture, some of the groups that we found over here in Syria. But we're going to note that that group also is going to go into areas over here, right? And they're also going to go over here, that D group. So we're going to note the D group actually goes over here and having connections to all these little areas. So that's very important. We also know that later on, modern times, we find some D groups that go into Nigeria. So that's something that's also kind of interesting. Also, they're also in Arabia. So we'll have D groups in Nigeria, in Arabia, and the earliest ones in Japan, and in the little islands, the Pacific Islands that's over here. So we'll have some D groups that settle in these areas. And then the E groups, what we're going to note is that the E groups, they're going to start here because our oldest one is a Natufian by the age of 39,000 years ago. We also got a 42,000 year ago evidence that D and E split in the Middle East. So we know that they had split in the Middle East, and that group actually diversified, and most of them actually end up going up here and across here. They actually go up here early and across here. That's actually important. Before they even go into Africa, they're found over here. They do a thing like this. You see how they bend like that? And they're settled right here. They stop about there, and then what happens is, I don't know which way they make it, but there's a separate group, E1B1A group, that apparently may have caught a ride somewhere, and it made its way all the way to basically over here. That's actually where it made it. It made it all the way. It made it all the way right over here. That's what I show. We're going to show E1B1A that left, and we're talking BC time frame. I'm talking before it even touched Africa, before the fossil even touched Africa, because we know that same fossil was also found in BMAC culture. This same group ends up developing over here in the BMAC culture, be a group that's going to grow over here. It's going to be in a lot of different places. I'm also going to show you evidence of it settling over here in Arabia. It's going to be a group that we'll look at when we go over the D&E group. We're going to put it on the map when we do. And I'm going to show you that they fought with some Neanderthals, because if you look in the biblical narrative, you can even see that Edom was basically Neanderthals. Edom, if you look closely in the biblical narrative, he was fighting giants. And if you look carefully at what the Neanderthals is and all these ancient groups, they're just ancient humanoids. And when I say they was fighting Neanderthals, they were fighting some ancient humanoids. Somehow, some way, I don't know what to say about them, where they came from or whatnot, but some may have slipped the gaps. But here's an interesting study right here that we'll talk about a group right in this area. We'll talk about a group because, yes, the Natufian are settled in this area, but there's some places that will take a little interesting insight too, I think, that will give an interesting insight to some things. Like this little paper here that talks about basically some movements during the pre-pottery Neolithic B time frame. That's going to talk about some of the movements of basically what is called the Natufian group that ends up settling in some of these places. And based on, I don't know if you say it, El-Qam, I don't know if I'm saying that right, but in this little area, we're going to get some interesting movements, pretty much. We'll get some interesting movements, I think. So it just says that El-Qam points appear to a Natufian. It's just epipaleolithic, right? Contact from the Sinai, right? It just talks about Sinai. Obviously got different connections with Syria and the Levant, Lebanon and whatnot, Israel, right? Euphrates, right? And the Syrian Middle Euphrates and whatnot. There's a couple of different things that we'll talk about where this lineage actually settles and develops at and increases, in contrast to the A and B groups, which are actually the real Hamitic groups. It's going to be a very important contrast to see that these groups are actually fairly different, but they're going to have some interesting places that they settle in fairly early. And also we can look at the linguistics. So we'll talk about that and talk about the linguistic ties, the South Semitic and different Semitic groups that have ties together. We'll talk about some of those things and a couple different connections. Has some set aside. So I just want to show that real fast. I have some things set aside that I think sitting down and going over it carefully, we might learn some interesting things, of some interesting migrations and everything. And I'm talking, remember, we usually touch on ancient stuff, right? We're going on ancient stuff. And we're talking modern humans still, even though it sounds like it's not. A lot of it may sound like it's not. But that's the thing when talking about where these humans must have set at. You can see as it talks about right here, some interesting thing real fast. The basal Eurasian lineage is the signature of ancient non-Africans who, obviously it says, diverse from the common European Eastern pool before 50,000 years ago, prior to the interbreeding with Neanderthals. Why is that important? Because your GHIJK, all of them have a Neanderthal admixture, right? All of them have when they say Neanderthal, they're more closely related to that group, while your A and B group is closer related to your Homo erectus. That actually is a different lineage. So it's kind of interesting, but they're not that closer to the Neanderthal mixture. But some reason the CF group does. So it's really interesting when going over it, when looking at these things. We'll talk about that because that's what we was talking about when we was talking about some other things recently, when we talk about some other things fairly recently, when we talk about this area over here and what was over there and what was found in these areas that has connections to different things. So it's kind of what's the word I'm looking for? It's kind of interesting. The finds is kind of interesting. They'll kind of put a clear picture, I believe. They'll kind of tie pictures together. So we're going to be doing that. We're going to put it on the map and really expressing the biblical narrative and the evidence of these things, that it makes perfect sense. The reading of the book and seeing what we see today definitely makes a lot of sense. Let me just read another piece. Now, let me just point out two spots. Remember I was pointing out this here, over here and the Nubian. So there's a group called the Iberasians or Iberasians. I call them Iberasians, basically connection to Eber. They talk about those. It says also the ancient Iberasians or Iberasians, how you say that, speech specimens could be in part descendants of basal Eurasians, right? As they have a shared genetic affinity with the early Paleocene, I probably said that weird, Near Easterners. Best proxy are the Natufians, and 1/3 of the input from sub-Saharan Africans, a mixture between Western and Eastern Africans. So you see what's going on there? And what do they say about these ancient lineages? That they're one, Eurasian, and two, they're related. So these lines are related, having connections to Asia, but then also going to have later connections to African, because they're going to go into Africa. So that's very important, because what's important to know is that when you got these ancient lines, you got to note that they're going to move together. And we also can note that almost every group goes into Africa before E1B1A does. That's a true statement that few people actually know. That almost get T's in Africa before you get E1B1A in Africa. you get R's in Africa before you get E1B1A in Africa. This is without a doubt. This is without a doubt. This is a fact that we're going to talk about. We're going to talk about some real scientific facts, real observable facts of genetics, real actual observable facts that we will see in genetics and what genetics actually would say. Some interesting things. So they'll talk about obviously some interesting mixtures. Here's some admixture with Neanderthals, they'll say, and they'll talk about some interesting movements of different groups that will be moving around, like some of the basal Eurasians, and obviously the Natufian groups. Just to show it right there. See the Natufian, and then what would have became the Iberasians from the Natufian, the Iberasians leaving from the Natufian, but the Natufian also becomes some of the groups that will settle in some of these areas. But they fill out, the Natufian fill out all of this, all the way to Yemen. They fill out all this, the Natufian. They're going to fill out all these areas. So it's very important. We're going to point that out. And remember, that's still, going back to the map, that's still going to be this group. So if we get the Natufian filling out this whole area, we can get a good understanding that they could easily spill into this area. And that's what I was showing last time with Mota is an E1B1. And E1B1 is found in the Natufian, right? E1B1 is found in the Natufian. We'll talk about that because the Natufian, we're going to talk about them. We have to. We have to talk about them because if we don't, we'll be missing a major picture ending. So we're going to be talking about the movement of these groups into very important areas. That's going to basically make a clear picture. The line that we're talking about, that's a Semitic culture that is not ancient Semitic or not Afro-Semitic. When I say Afro-Semitic, not the Hamitic Semitic, I'm talking about the Semitic that's used in the biblical narrative, which is modern Semitic. And that's what they speak. They speak a modern Semitic. That's the thing about what they say about the Natufian, that they speak a modern Semitic, which is Arabian or the Hebrew. So you can see that's going to be P2. So E1B1, right in the Natufian culture. So that's going to be very important to know about his movements and everything. So it's going to be obviously important to understand when we note these things and whatnot. Obviously got connections to some of the other groups. And you can see obviously who else they got connections to, the Omic. Natufian has connected to the Omic groups, right? Omic groups. That's going to be an E1B1A group. So you can see E1B1 has connections to the Omic group. And if you look at the Omic group, right, the Omic people that go down into the areas of Africa a little later, Omic people, you just got to go to this. You can find out easy that their basically genetics is E1B1, pretty much. E1B1, E1B1A, pretty much. E1B1A is going to be their lineage. It's a show. I don't know why I went to this, but let me go back since it took me all over there under V38 right here. And there it is. You can see this E1B1A group is actually going to obviously be especially among the Omic speaking groups. So it's very important that that's what we know is the Natufian, as we had talked about before, some of the larger groups today that we see as Africans. They become the leading lineage in Africa. They aren't the original lineage leading in Africa, but we'll talk about that. We'll put them on a chart and show it where they were before they were in Africa. We're going to show where they were by the fossils before they were in Africa and how they became the Akkadian group and how they became other groups and went into the BMAC culture before they even went into Africa. Because we actually know they had a battle. They fought against a group in Africa. They was fighting against a group of Africa. And that was a event that is kind of important to know about, which we'll talk about when the season comes again, because we already talked about it before, but we'll talk about it again, how the Natufian were fighting in the lands of Africa, which we talked about just recently, right here. I'll just point it out real quick. Here's a little talk of that battle that they were earliest war grave found with 27 slain 10,000 years ago. And we were talking about that. This article from Nature and a couple of different things. So some very, very, very heavy stuff. But it was in Africa. It happened in Africa. And it was, and why? Because two groups went at it. Two are separate. They're not related. And they weren't even to each other. And they are going to at it. And we're going to show how separate groups, the Natufian group and what will be the African hunter-gatherers. That's what they call them, basically hunter-gatherers. Talk about that, the hunter-gatherers. Because the study it says the author of the study says the broken skeletons of the hunter-gatherers provides evidence that there were intergroup violent prehistoric hunter-gatherers. Talked about this before, it goes deep. I don't even know if this talks about that it was the Natufian. This one, nope, it doesn't even say anything. But we did was the Natufian fighting against the hunter-gatherers. That was what was happening. The Natufian were the ones that were fighting against the hunter-gatherers. Just show a quick summary on this, if I could. Right here. It says the most ancient archaeological record of what could have been a prehistoric massacre is at the site of this one, pretty much in the lands of Africa. And look at that, so after the Younger Dryas, as it even says, dates to the Younger Dryas. And it says right here, committed by the Natufian. By who? The Natufian. Against whom? The hunter-gatherers of Africa. So the Natufian who settle in this area and fill up the upper area of the Levant are going to be different than the original hunter-gatherers of Africa that we'll talk about. And we'll point out what is the earlier hunter-gatherers that would exist at the same time as the Natufian. As the Natufian are a Levantan and Semitic culture that settles in the upper areas of the Levant. But they came down into Sudan and made war with a certain group called the Qadan culture. We'll talk about them. That actually is the original Egyptians that we talked about before. We have pointed this out before. It's AM13. The original Egyptians are AM13, A and B groups. We'll talk about it. We're going to get into it. We're going to get really deep into this thing. So I just want to, again, today, I'm hearing the sound. It sounds okay. Everything sounds all right. So I wanted to make sure we don't have any lags for it because it's going to be a very deep one. It's going to be something that I think, going over is going to bring some very interesting edification to some things. But it's all about these things. These heavier things happen about the transition of said, what they call Mesolithic to Neolithic to Bronze Age, right? So it's going to be a couple different changes that happen, right? Even the understanding of these things is going to be kind of interesting, but it's going to have some deep stuff. I think some fairly deep things to go over that might give some edification to some things. So again, that's what we're going to be going over. We're going to be talking about how they know that this culture that stopped at the Red Sea, right? The Natufian culture divides against another culture that's going to divide in ancient times, right? Ancient times. And we're going to show you that the Natufian culture is Semitic, but the other culture is not Semitic. Now, some people, may feel one thing about idea and all these things, but we're going to show it even with the linguistics, the separation of these and these different. Now, later on, you'll start to see these groups kind of mix. That's why if you look in the Bible, there's a group called, who are the Sabaeans. They're a mix of actually Hamites and Japhanites. I mean, not Japhanites, Hamites and Shemites, rather. The Sabaeans, the word Sabaean actually comes from the term second, the second. Sabaean actually means the second. Sabaean actually is a group of the Hamitic groups and the Shemitic groups that were going at the Jotanites that were mixing a little bit with the sons of Cush and women of Cush, rather, and they were going at it. And we're talking, this is like, I got sources that say this happened almost 18 BC, right? Long time ago when they were doing that. But then the Natufian, by the genetic culture, they first, but then they spilled in. They were taking land from another culture and pushing them downwards, pushing them deeper and deeper in Africa as they were going at it. They were backing up and they were shrinking and destroying them. And until this other came up. It was from the E1B1 lineage. You'll first get the E1B1B lineage basically spreading out and dominating. And I'm going to show you that it dominates the E lineage dominates all areas, even some here. But the D lineage starts to dominate over here. And that's one family, the D and E lineage. But there's an E1B1A mutation that comes. And that one actually comes out from the mutation, earliest find of it. We start to find it branching off from after these lines that must have happened here was pushed off, and they start to dwell in these areas, and they start to develop over here and over here. But the E1B1A will be here, and then it moves downwards. And for some reason, it comes back. It comes back over here, and we find it over here in a culture over here. After we find it, some reason in Peru. We find it in Peru, and we'll talk about it. It all sounds like it's spreading quickly, but it's apparently, but we find the fossils in all these places. We find it here, in Peru, before we even find it in Africa. And then we'll talk about its movement to Africa, how it got into Africa, how they moved into the land of Africa. And that's why if we notice, Mota right here is not a 1, it's a 5. Because after they develop here, develop in other places, you'll soon later get a Mota. And then that Mota is actually going to be from that E1B1 that settles over here. And then you get a nice group. But their homeland is over here. Their homeland is going to be over here that we're going to know. But the original Africans are going to be this group, though. They call them hunter-gatherers. We'll talk about that. But some of this group apparently also comes over here. This African group is found in America, ancient times. And we'll talk about that. For some reason, this group ends up going over there to lands of America. But the E group goes into Peru. So this one goes into later America, not in the earliest times, but a little later it goes in there. But in its earliest times, this lineage, let me just grab this. This lineage actually, in its earliest times, apparently made a massive movement with Japheth. From this area, we're going to see that he's going to end up moving and settling the lands of pretty much some of the cultures over here and over here. A lot of different cultures around this area, they end up basically having allegiance with. But then they end up going down and then settling these areas down here after they have their little connection. So they have almost like a kind of like a triangle connection. They have this kind of like a triangle. So they go to these areas and they go down. And we know that the BM60 actually is going to be have connections to Arabia. In our time, we see that BM60 has a lot of lineages in Arabia. For example, let me just show you something. See if I can find it real fast. B-181 Y tree. Let me just see if I can point this out real fast on here, just to show a quick example here. The B group is one of the groups that probably not a lot of people looked in, but if you notice, it will have a lot of lineages that will actually be obviously in Africa, but it will also have evidence of being outside of Africa. As you can see right here, this B group right there in Arabia. And you can see it's quite a lot actually in Arabia compared to Africa. So today is actually a lot in Arabia. So it's kind of interesting when looking at that. Because if you look at the B information on the B group, just to kind of show that. And all this is just, introduction to what we're going to do, about to get into. So I just want to have this live here for this little conversation of this. But let me point out something on this B group that I think is kind of important. See if I can find it. Here it is. You can see family tree shows a significant number of persons of B-M60, which is a mutation BM181, claiming origins from the Arabian Peninsula, right? Predominantly Saudi Arabia, but also in Kuwait. So you can see all these different areas and whatnot. And they just talk about the genetics that they get and that they're testing and what they find there and everything. And they just talk about, obviously, looking at the people, they obviously have a lot of connections to Arabia now, but masses of them, right? Not just like a small migration, but once we look at some of the information, it's known that it would make sense of its area where it's at. So you can see this BM181. As you can see, obviously its largest group is in Saudi Arabia. So the largest group that we find them is actually in Saudi Arabia. So actually not that much people in Africa, but more people in Saudi Arabia have that lineage. So that's kind of interesting to note that B group actually has some large areas today in Saudi Arabia. So we'll talk about that. This is going to have some ancient connections to gatherers and a couple different things, and some linguistics. Like, for example, just food for thought. What linguistics we're going to look at? We want to look at one language of the Saharan language, which is going to be basically the term of Yoruba, and we're going to be taking it all the way back to its roots. Yoruba. Now we gotta be careful with Yoruba. Like any other language, Yoruba picks up later Semitic dialect, right? I'm talking loan words, Semitic loan words, the Arabian loan words. Just to show that, but the earlier form didn't. The earlier forms did not have those loan words. Ones did. I don't know what's this. Let me close that. The newer ones the newer ones had the loan words. The older ones didn't. Show something that we'll talk about when the time comes. As you get right here comes the loan words. It says basically right here of the rise of the Islamic faith and everything, and basically in Yoruba to basically the Muslims and whatnot. It says the Arabic word. They picked up a couple different loan words, pretty much. Long story short, I'm not gonna read from this because I got a source that we'll talk about. I got something better than what this would show. But they picked up some loan words. They picked up some loan words along the way, as even there just talk about, as the Islamic conquest grew, obviously they picked up some of those Arabian Semitic later on. But if you notice about this language and you look at its ancient roots, right, his actual original establishment is ancient. This ancient language that many picked up later on, there's different people who picked up this later on. We know that, as it says, as of the 7th century BC, the African people who lived in, they say, Yoruba land were not intentionally known as Yoruba. So they obviously weren't known as Yoruba. And so in that land, they weren't known as Yoruba long ago. We'll talk about that. But that came later. And also that has some ties to some of the Semitic linguistics and those things. But before that, Before that, the people there that would be there 7th century BC are not even the E groups, are not the E groups. It's going to be a different group that's going to be actually in that land called Yoruba land at that time. So it's going to be kind of interesting where we kind of get an insight on a couple different things. So we'll look at some interesting ties, I think. That's just an insight. I don't want to go too much more into it. Just we'll leave it just like that because they all got to go together with some things. So we'll talk about some things and whatnot, and talk about 6. So we'll talk about what was the original language, what they call it, or how was it worded? What was their original linguistics? And it'll be a little different than Afro-Asiatic. It's going to be a little different. The ancient groups of the hunter-gatherers. The hunter-gatherers had some different linguistics. Mergings of people. So leave it at that. So that's just what we're going to do. So tomorrow we're going to touch on Helm first. And after we touch on Helm, I'm going to just set a day off, and then we're going to get into Yahweh and Shem and put them on the map. So we'll put Helm, Shem, and Japheth. We already got Japheth, right? We already got Japheth for the most part. But we're going to talk about the movements of, as we said, from the Natufian going out at its ancient origins, spreading across France and Spain for some E1, B1, B groups and E groups, and settling obviously in the Iberasian area. And that same lineage stretches across the areas of Arabia and is going to get to the edge of Yemen. We know because also the women are found in that area of Yemen. We're going to find them there in ancient times. I'm talking L lineages and whatnot. But also remember this lineage mixed with almost every female. When I say every female, almost every your M groups, your N groups, and your L groups all mix with the Natufians. So early lineages of these Natufians basically have almost every lineage in them. So sometimes you'll find these E lineages with different colors, skin colors. So just understand that you'll find different skin colors even today. If you look up E1B1B, you'll find some groups that are dark skinned, some groups are light skinned, right? E1B1B is actually large in a lot of people today, in a lot of different cultures, because they, as you can see, they were massive and they made a massive movement. So they're gonna obviously have some spillage. They're gonna spill into these areas. This group here is gonna spill into these areas. We're gonna look at that some of it leaks into some of these areas. That's just what happens throughout time, and it's gonna go into some of these different areas. It's gonna have some ties to different areas and whatnot, stretching out really far. But obviously later on it's gonna go into these areas and take these areas from these groups, and that's what we was talking about with some of them that was fighting the ones in Egypt. They was fighting some of the groups, the Natufian that started in this area were fighting against a group called hunter-gatherers that were in this area and made them flee from them. And that group, as you see, is 3 here. First they were here, but then they were in this area until the Natufian fought them, and then they fled to here and here. So some went down into deeper Africa and some went over here. But then for some reason these groups pursued them and continued going forward down. And that is understandable because even at that time, all these groups up here are fighting as well. A lot of these groups are fighting. I don't know why they just start fighting, but they were fighting. They were going off and they were battling each other. But we're going to talk about it and how it is going to give some edification to some things. And remember, this group here, we're going to talk about how it has ties to up here, right? That it's going to call the people to come down to Shinar, and then it's going to go through its motions. It's going to go through its whole motions and everything and get basically pushed around. So we'll talk about that as well as the linguistics and everything, or the language, where we find some evidence of the language and everything. And we'll talk about how the Proto-Afro-Asiatic that also may have connection to Elamite, right? The Proto-Afro-Asiatic that may have connections to Elamite, that makes what languages do Afro-Asiatic make? right? Obviously, you'll get your different languages like your West Semitic, which is your what? Akkadian, Arabic, and your Hebrew. So Afro-Asiatic mixed Hebrew. And we'll talk about that this family, that is that mass Afro-Asiatic family, is going to be one that's going to have some ties to ancient origins of the biblical narrative individuals. So we'll talk about some of those things, like as it says right here, right? West Semitic languages, which include both Arabic and Hebrew, but also all, right? When you think about other epigraphic languages of the Near East, such as Akkadian. So, remember we talked about the Omic culture and stuff like that. Obviously, they're Semitic, right? All those are Semitic. We'll talk about those things, and we'll talk about the connection of these groups and whatnot. Obviously, having connections between 8th century BC, right? Natufian, 8th century BC to 6th century AD. So very important. We'll talk about that. And we'll point out how linguists actually confirm that Natufian are not any type of Semitic, right? Because there's different types of Semitic, yes. But they are going to be Arabian Hebrew Semitic. They're going to be modern Semitic, right? So that's going to be important. They're that branch of Semitic. They're this branch, the Akkadian branch of Semitic. That's what makes it important. So that's going to be very, very important for understanding some things. So we'll talk about all those things and whatnot in the battles. So with that, that's all I got for you today, family. Nothing much today, just a couple of insights to what we're going to do. And I'm going to see how the sound is today and everything, and see how everything sounded and whatnot. So, but if you have any questions before I go, I really, isolate anything today, but we were talking about a couple different things, I guess. And if you have any questions on that, definitely let me know before we take off. But we will get into some interesting things, and we'll talk about some interesting things that may give clear insight to the biblical tale, the biblical story that we see in the world today. All right, let me make sure I'm close these. I don't think that's anything on this. Just close that. I don't need that. Close that. These just extra stuff. All right. So I just wanted to do that today, give a quick little insight on some things and have some room for going over what we might go over, willing, tomorrow. And that should be interesting. I think one more thing I wanted to show before I end this. Now, notice how I was pointing out this area, right? If you look today, that would be a desert area, right? That area would be a desert area. But there was a remember how I talked about this? Obviously, we're going to have to talk about the proto channels. There was a proto channel. There was a proto channel there, and we know because we got evidence through ancient satellites and things like that. Ancient, uncovered ancient array. Was an ancient river there, and you know what rivers mean? Rivers mean that it's going to have life in that area, right? They're going to have life in a certain place. It's called river. Let me see if I can just show that little proto river here. Here's a kind of an idea. It's basically this river. I wouldn't call it Pison, but it is a river in Arabia. None of these really got what I want to show, even though those are kind of okay. But there's a proto river we'll talk about and everything. We'll talk about the proto river and why the river is important for migration and how we find certain people around that ancient river and everything. So it just talks about some of those things. I know I was looking to see if this had a picture of it and everything, but we'll talk about it. We'll talk about the river. Let me just make sure and whatnot. All right, just making sure. Yeah. All right. So we'll get on some things. We'll get on some things and we'll talk about some things to kind of make a good insight to look in. But you can see, like it says right here, I'll just read it. It says Arabia has had wet periods at times over the past, they say, 200,000 years. Water last flowed in that El Baz called the Kuwait River between 5,000 to 11,000 years ago. So that's what we're going to be looking at, about 5,000 to 11,000 years ago, right after the Younger Dryas. And then all of a sudden that river dried up. And that's why you don't see large groups in the center of Arabia. But ancient times, you're going to see it was actually a lot of people there in that time. There was a populated group that's going to be there. We'll talk about it. It's going to be Natufians and some other groups that met them there, right? If you already heard about it in the Bible, right? Havilah, right? Havilah actually has connections to two different lines. Havilah and whatnot, you'll have interesting connections to sons of Ham, I believe is a son of Cush, and a son of Shem, which is from Jotun. So that name actually would have interesting ties, but those two groups go at it in the biblical narrative. You'll know that these groups went at it and they formed the Sabaean because there's historical documents on who the Sabaean are, that they are a Semitic group or a group that merged together, that settled about in the area of Punt, right? Connecting two continents together, Punt, right? We're talking a corner of Arabia and Ethiopia. So contrasting those two areas, but you're going to see a culture that ties all these areas together. It's going to basically bring these things to life, pretty much. They all go together. And we know without a doubt that they seen that there was a river there. And the fossils are going to be around that area as well. So it makes perfect sense that we'll find these things around that same area that we'll talk about. So again, just today's summary. So all we're doing is a summary, nothing ending heavy right now. I just want to show you some things. We got some things to talk about and clarify, because it's going to give a perfect picture to what we're seeing in the world today. We got some things to talk about and to clarify, to bring understanding to the truth of what we're seeing today. So this is just getting on some different things that's we're going to go over. It's going to be something that's going to bring a lot of edification to what we're seeing. It's going to be, what's the word I'm looking for? Quite needed. I think it'd be quite needed. But this is talking about some interesting connections, some interesting family connections that we'll talk about on the change of climate and everything that we talked about before and everything. See, despite the poor climate conditions for recovery of ancient DNA, human evidence in Arabia, ancient, right? Ancient. We're talking ancient, right? Because they're going to be talking about basal Eurasian lineage is the signature of ancient non-African that basically, when they say diverged from the common European East Asian pool before 50,000 years ago. And they're just talking about, obviously, they're going to have Neanderthals there. They're going to talk about some couple different things that's going to be in Arabia and the Levant, and having a couple different things that's going to be in these different areas. But we're going to be looking at ancient genetics. We're going to be looking at some ancient genetics and looking at some interesting admixtures. We're talking Arabia, right? We're talking places that, should be looked at, right? Early places, very, very early places. And obviously it's letting us know in the connection of things. That's why we're going to also be using the 1,000 genomes sheet, so that we know who is connected, who is related, and whatnot. Like, as we know, all F groups are one. F-M89 makes one family. So that's going to be important when we go over this information. So we're going to be looking at the root, connecting the Semitic language, as well as connecting the other lineages, the Hamitic lineage and whatnot, and what they have connections and ties to. So we'll be talking about some of those things and their connections, because it's going to be, what's the word I'm looking for? Edifying. It's gonna be quite edifying, I think. I think it'll be quite edifying. So, again, summary. What we're gonna talk about and what we just did. We're gonna talk about basically later on when we talk about an ancient culture that actually was in the Levant and had ties to other cultures. Will be some of the earliest cultures, and some reason even had ties with Neanderthals and whatnot. And that same group is going to have ties with what is called the hunter-gatherers, which are going to be another group that's going to have some connections as well. So going to be some ancient humanoids, but from the beginning of the video that we was doing today, we was showing how geneticists know that many Neanderthals are actually just humans, that they're just basically humans. And actually they know that modern humans actually have some major genetic ties to ancient humanoids more than people think. And it'll be something that's important. For example, right, by about, man, we'll talk about that, 18, right, or 8,000 BC, 8,500 BC. We would talk about the between 11,000 and 8,000 BC. We'll talk about some things with that, and we'll get into some things later. Local populations were considerably higher than the earlier times. So what happened? They're talking about after the Younger Dryas, there was a bloom of population. We'll talk about it, that the population increased. But at the Natufian Paleolithic time, right after, because remember I said that millions of years ago to about 11,000 years ago, which was after the Younger Dryas, it's the Paleolithic time frame. But then it says by this time frame, to the Neolithic, obviously populations was larger, leading to the emergence of a more complex social order. The Natufians buried their dead in cemeteries, right, which had yielded a wealth of information on their society, obviously. And they just go on they'll talk about some things and whatnot, and a couple different things of the Natufian, and a couple different things of people who they had to deal with. Like, for example, the fossil remains referred to the Neanderthal are currently known. They just talk about they had a connection in Europe when they talk about the Neanderthals and everything. But they'll get some interesting insight, some very interesting insight on the Neanderthals and their connection with some of these ancient humanoids and whatnot. We'll go on it. We'll get on it and we'll make it make sense. I'll show you what's going on with a lot of this stuff that at first it may seem like what's going on. Neanderthals, Natufians, you got all this stuff. But you'll see when we go over it. That's why you get scripture. You'll get scripture that will talk about what Edom fought and other groups fought, and they'll talk about there were giants in those days, and there was these creatures or these humanoids with different names and stuff, with names that you look at, you're like, what kind of names is that? You see this scripture right here, Deuteronomy 2, 7 to 12. It says, where it just goes on and talks about what happened. And when we passed by from our brothers, the children of Esau, which dwelled in Seir, right? Through the way of the plain of Eleth, and from this name, right? It just talks about some things, and it says, right? It says he gave a certain land to obviously Ammon and Moab and whatnot. But it talks about these people called Amims, right? Amims. It says the Amims, right? Who are the Amims? And the Alekim, and a couple of different of these groups. The Amims dwelled there in times past, a people great and many and tall as the Alekims. It says, which also were accounted giants. And you're going to find out that a lot of these apparently were in Arabia. And the Alekim, right, as they were giants as Alekim, but the Moabites called them Amims. So the Moabites call these giant groups Amims. And the Horims, which dwelled in Seir before time, right? So these groups dwelled there before time, but the children of Esau obviously succeeded them when they had destroyed them from before them and dwelled in their stead, right? As Israel did in their land and everything. So we'll talk about some of those things and whatnot. Some of these ancient species that apparently also shows that they had contact with the humans and for some reason there show some early ties on some things, right? So I'll leave it off on this. Right, there are several lines of evidence that support the idea of connection between the Neolithic in the Near East and in the Indian subcontinent, because we're going to connect it like that. It's going to be like that. We're going to connect it all over. We're going to be connected like that. And the prehistoric site, just talk about another site in Pakistan and everything, is the earliest Neolithic site in the near West Indian subcontinent, dated as early as 8,500 BC. 8,500 BC. Does that year sound kind of familiar? Right? By about 8,500 BC, we talk about some things, and we talk about the Natufian, a couple different things, and a couple different things that was going on in the Levant that happened after 9,000 BC. The climate of the Levant became progressively drier, just as Natufian population were expanding. Right, the effect of the new drought cycle was to shrink the cereal and the food and whatnot. Obviously, what happened at the same time that the Natufian were forced to spend longer periods of time and basically sedentary settlements. Right, sounds like they're going to be they're going to be people who settle down and settle in places and everything close to permanent water supplies. Why do you need water? Because water is important. Right, it just goes and just talks about some things. We'll talk about some things and whatnot, and when we connect these things. Right, it's just like I said, these just highlights and stuff. I'll just show you where that came from. Here, we'll talk about some things. The Near Eastern roots of the Neolithic in South Asia. We're going to talk about the roots, where the Natufian actually went. We're going to talk about where they actually went after the Natufian culture. Which places did they spread in? And we're going to notice that when we go over these things. We'll talk about some real movements of ancient cultures and whatnot. And obviously, it's going to have information that's going to tie together. And I don't know if on this it talks about it. We'll talk about it when we go over it. It's not on this one, but we'll talk about it when we go over it. That the Natufian, the groups that would be ancient humanoids that would settle in the Levant, are going to go into a lot of places very early. And they go into the upper coast earlier than they go into the lower coast. We'll talk about some of these things when the time comes. So we'll close that. So again, like I said, everything that we're going to go over is going to be ancient stuff. We're going to talk about really, really ancient stuff that's going to be kind of important. And then we'll talk about the difference between the Natufian that become pastoralists. That's why I said they settle down, they become pastoralists, and how they go at it against what they call the hunter-gatherers, right? Just a quick one more thing. A largely accepted paradigm in Africa or African recent prehistory considers pastoralism to be the main subsequent source of food, obviously producing communities, along obviously the Sudanese Nile Valley from about 6,000 BC, right? 6,000 millennia BC onwards. So that's where we'll talk about the rise of pastoralism, right? Because I'll talk about the Natufian aren't yet pastoralists. Yeah, that's true. Not many people are pastoralists, but we do know where it rises, and we'll talk about that. We'll talk about how it ended up rising, why it rise the way that it rose, and what culture it was, to kind of make it understandable when we bring it together, that they did enter into some interesting lower areas and a couple interesting things happen, right? And we'll talk about those things because it's going to be kind of interesting when tying the whole piece together, because there's going to be two cultures. One more time, there's going to be two cultures. There's going to be your A and B cultures. There's going to be your B cultures. Well, your A and B cultures. There's going to be your D and E cultures. These are two separate cultures. Let's just leave it like that. the A and B cultures and the D and E cultures are going to be two separate cultures, right? We'll talk about these things and whatnot, and what's going on with the ties of all these things and how they lead into each other. And we'll point out the fact that the Akkadian group does become the E1B1 group, that they're the group that's going to be your original Semitic group. We'll talk about that when they talk about Afro-Asiatic. As they say, the two best candidates for Afro-Asiatic haplogroup are obviously haplogroup E1B1B and whatnot. And they just talk about some things when we go over some things. So just some interesting insights real fast. We'll talk about this one, right? This E1B1B group that we find in almost a lot of the places of Syria, right? Alika and other places, whatnot, that was settled in certain areas that we'll have a little conversation on, and we'll point out some things. All right. So with that, family, that's just a quick summary. Like I said, it's just a quick summary today. Nothing too deep, but a quick introduction to some things that is kind of interesting. And like I said, we'll talk about how even those ancient humanoids and whatnot, because we got to talk a little bit about them, is that they went at it with some different peoples, right? Right here it says the best evidence that Neanderthals not only fought but excelled at war is that they met us and wasn't immediately overrun. Instead, for about, they say, 100,000 years, Neanderthals resisted modern human expansion. So very important. We'll talk about some things. How are they resisting? Were they fighting? Yeah. We'll talk about some things. We'll talk about some things that were happening. We'll talk about some things that was going on in the Levant and Arabia and Africa. So connecting 3 continents together, and obviously areas of Europe and Asia. But obviously it's going to be connecting ancient cultures, especially like the Natufian and things like that. It's going to be talk about what happened, their movements and everything, and what was going on, what was the change that happened over time, right? We'll talk about how from one time frame, we'll get the Natufian after the Younger Dryas. Then you have these different cultures, how the Natufian become like the Sumerians and things like that, and connections to other groups. So we'll get into some things. We'll get into some things and talk about some things in season. So with that, family, if you got any questions before I end it, let me know. Otherwise, as you see, this is just a highlight again, right? If you came in late, or if you missed something you didn't, just doing a quick summary of things. But y'all willing, tomorrow, 3 p.m. Central Time, I'm going to go into Helm. And to understand Helm, we're going to track them on a map just to kind of make it. And it's going to look kind of like this to kind of make it make sense that Helm is going to start around these areas, not here. That's what's actually shocking, that no one at its earliest stage actually started in Africa, but they did. There is an early lineage that was in Africa at its earliest time. So the earliest lineage, we'll talk about the earliest lineage just in Africa until the E groups enter into them, until they enter in later on. But then we'll go over the Semitic movements, which is kind of complex, but very interesting to see. So as you can see, this line that we consider Shem sits about in the middle. So he's about here in the middle. Japheth is going to be obviously the one that's in the north, large, filling up the upper areas. And then Helm is actually the earliest lineage, not the largest. This is where we got to be careful at. The largest lineage today doesn't determine that they're the most ancient lineage today. So the largest lineage in Africa today doesn't define that it was the most ancient lineage today in ancient time. So we'll look at that. Which one was the most oldest in Africa versus which one wasn't. So just to show those two things, because those are the two things we want to touch on. How the Hamitic lines, the line that said hunter-gatherers were going at it with the Natufians that became pastoralists. The Natufians will be like the pastoralists that become pastoralists. And the hunter-gatherers will be the ones that will be in Africa hunting and gathering. but they end up fighting with these groups. So these two groups go at it. And there's fossils to show this actually happened, that these battles happen. And these are two different groups. So with that, family, that's all I got for now. I'm going to actually put this little picture. I want to say that. I might put this little picture on one of these notes. Maybe I'll put it right here. I'll just put this note in the description. Right, just this BT split one. And this is an interesting picture that we'll keep building on. But like I said, remember, now that we have the whole total picture of things, we don't have to worry about if it's going to change. Fossils are fossils; they don't change. They just get more edified. They just get more edification to what's the situation. But I'll put this here, and this is going to be our map for now. So with that, I want you to be blessed, family. And if you have any questions, let me know. Yeah, that's right. Let's see. That's an interesting question. So then the Philistines, because I believe Goliath was only 7 feet. Most likely they wasn't bigger than 7 feet. I mean, bigger than the Philistines. They could have been around 7 feet, because you got some tall Neanderthals and some big bodied Neanderthals and whatnot. But they could be about 7 or 8 feet. And that would have felt like a giant to humans. And also you got to remember, size of humans differ. Size of a human differ. So sometimes, especially back then, humans had kind of a smaller structure. So they'd be like sitting around 4 feet, 5 feet. So seeing someone about 7 feet, 8 feet, that's double their size, or even a massive that's just a massive advantage, right? It's not the same thing like today where someone walks around with a gun or something. You're walking around with, if you're lucky, a bow and arrow or some type of tool, and finding some giant of a man or giant of a crew of men, and they're already war ready and they got these giant weapons, might not look like the best situation to be in. So that's probably the reason why it's more they're seen as giants, is because they would have a nice size to them. Even like that Goliath being only about like 7 feet, 8 feet between there, it's still going to be considered pretty massive if you're fighting a hand-to-hand combat. So that's more what it is when you think about a giant. Not necessarily like a giant as in they'll eat you, or they probably would eat you, because apparently some of those Neanderthals in certain groups were eating people. But the giantism, it could be a disease that caused that giantism, or it could be some type of rare mutation that caused that certain group to all be massive. That family, a certain lineage of families, can be extremely massive and powerful. That's right. That's right. And that's the one we were just talking about, that Israel kicked a lot of those humanoids out of the land. Yeah. The people that dwelled in Israel before the Israelites kicked them out, did they fight for the land, or was it theirs? It depends what group are we talking about, because remember, Israel, by the time of Abraham, he's entering into the picture from the transition of the late Bronze Age, entering into the early Iron Age. So we got the Neolithic, we got the Mesolithic, we got the Paleolithic time frame to account for before Abraham's time. So not necessarily the people in the Levant were going at it. They were basically going at it throughout all time. In fact, the most interesting story in the Bible is the event right before Abraham basically gets Lot, right? Some of the people from Mesopotamia, right? You got Elam, Shinar, a couple different other ones that band together. 5 kings come against other kings, and they go against, remember how they go against Sodom and Gomorrah, and they make the people flee and run, and they fall into these pits and everything. And pretty much that group basically settles down there to Abraham goes at it with them. He basically goes at it, pushes them out, and basically moves them all around. In fact, there's an interesting little that would help in that explanation of that I think is kind of a nice little video. Let me see if I can find it. It's a nice little video someone did. Saves Lot. Okay. the story where Abraham saves Lot. Here it is. I thought this was a nice summary on this thing. It's kind of interesting because I'll just skip a little ahead. So you see these kings up here. You got the king of Elam. You got Shinar from Babylon. You got basically a couple of different kingdoms. And they're going to basically come down and make their way into the land of the Levant. So they're coming from Mesopotamia. And this is when Abraham's there with Lot his nephew, and with obviously his family. I'm just gonna skip a little ahead on here. So they basically what the scripture talks about is that they make their way making their way down. So they attack pretty much most of these places. You can see this place called Ham, attack all these places. I'm sure that's probably has some symbolism that they destroy Ham. They destroy a lot of different places down here. And then what happens is, if you remember, they take Lot, right? They take Lot and they bring him out of the land and take him captive. So they're basically fighting against a couple kings in the lands over here. And the ones over here lose against the ones from the Mesopotamia. I don't know why they all band together to go down there, but it happens. But we know the people of Sodom and Gomorrah and other ones around, they lose. They lose. And what happens is basically they turn and they make their way basically back. Long story short is that they basically return. Let's see if you can hear this real fast.
Trained men born in his Sodom and Gomorrah flood.
So right here, so obviously they fled, but then what happens? Remember, Abraham gets his trained men, right? He gets his trained men, and they battle their way up to them and basically gets Lot. They basically battle their way up, and they're fighting, and they're moving, and they basically up to here, basically at this spot right here, pretty much is that they defeat them, and then they bring them back. Abraham brings them back, Lot and his family and whatnot, and then they come back and settle back in these places. And remember, that meets the king of righteousness, right? Melchizedek. That's the event where he meets Melchizedek, and Abraham gives a tenth to him, basically initiating that every single blood-born Israelite is considered that they already gave a portion to this king of righteousness. So that's kind of what that story is telling. It's like a story that's saying that their whole history is bound to this area, that this area that they're bound to the area of the Levant. So that's kind of an interesting tale that really the Levant, the battles, the amount of battles that's there is important to know. It's so many transitions of battles. Like even you think of Jericho, right? In the biblical narrative, we know Jericho fell, and is also evidence in its findings that the walls of Jericho fell. But what's also interesting is that Jericho, you got to look at the history of Jericho careful, because Jericho had multiple kingdoms in it. When I say multiple kingdoms throughout time, there were different dynasties in Jericho. So just because you find a culture, like for example, you might find an ancient E in Jericho, but later on you might find something like a J in Jericho, or you might find a different one in Jericho, because there's different layers, and it's called a tell. They call it a tell. So it's like different layers of a kingdom that builds on top of that fallen kingdom. And you'll have almost like these pancake layers of different kingdoms that stayed in one kingdom. So it's also being careful on the time frame of that dynasty that reigned over there. But I've seen a lot of history, but the Levant is one of the most war-ridden lands of all the lands. It's like there's never a time without a war. There's almost not a time where there's no war in the Levant. So the Levant is like the most. If you want to look up wars, look up the Levant. The Levant is full of it. There's so many wars there. So just to kind of like make that understood, is that's a great statement, because the Levant, to really illustrate it, is that we're thinking about something that we're not just looking at it at one point of time, but we're looking at pinpoint time frames. So if we want to find out who's an Israelite, we got to go all the way to the transition of the Iron Age, which would be about 11 or 10 BC, the transition of the Iron Age from the Bronze Age. But if we want to look at like ancient cultures, we got to go all the way back. So that's what we're going to do. We're going to look at the roots, and then we're going to work our way like we did with Japheth. We're going to look at the roots, look at the root culture, look at the history, and see how they come together. But this one's going to be kind of a little different because we're going to be kind of getting a pinpoint understanding on two cultures, which would be one would be how you say a culture which is going to be basically hunter-gatherer culture, which is going to be from the south, and another culture that becomes pastoralist that are going to be in the north, and they're going to be the Shemitic group. That's going to be the Natufian. So the Natufian are going to be different than when we're going to look at the other ones, which are hunter-gatherers. But there's also, like we said, with the other groups, the groups we looked at the first time. So we'll talk about some of these things because it is kind of what's the word I'm looking for? Important. These things are kind of important and brings insight to some things, I think. Brings some insight to some things and edifies some things. And we're going to obviously talk about where the pastoralists start to grow at and whatnot. So we'll talk about some things like area of predominant mobile pastoralism. So we'll talk about some things. And we'll talk about how this was a lot of the E group moving over here and having evidence of its pastoralism and whatnot. So we'll talk about some of these things and whatnot. Because Elam and other languages, they have some interesting linguistic ties. A lot of groups have some very interesting ties. So we'll talk about that. And point out their Y chromosome and some mtDNA on the way. Because that can edify in a way. So with that, family, today is just, like I said, we're just doing a quick summary of a lot of different things that we're going to talk about that are going to come together and paint a picture, and we're going to put them on the map, and we're going to see what's going on with these Natufian and that culture that they're fighting for some reason. So remember, if you got to remember anything, remember this. I'm just going to point this out just from here. Said about after the Younger Dryas, about 15,000 years ago, right, or close to around 11 and whatnot, a colony of Anu speakers expanded from the root of civilization, spreading north into the Nilo Valley and then the Near East, specifically the Levant. In the Levant, they became known as the Natufians, who were considered, right, just getting some understanding on them and everything. But we're gonna go into even this, what this is, what they talk about this, because we're gonna go into some roots of linguistics and roots of movements of certain things. But we'll get some understanding that you'll have some connections with different groups all around. That will have some different groups all around. As they say right here, when they talk about some of the first farmers and a couple different groups around, right, from the Neolithic to Bronze Age and everything. The Neolithic, Bronze Age, they talk about Europeans and other groups, obviously having connections together with the Natufians and other groups, right? Indirectly with sub-Saharan African populations. So we'll talk about some things. We'll talk about some things that needs to be known. Some things. Separate cultures and whatnot. Oh, I got one more thing before I end this that I want to point out real fast. So let me point this out real fast on here. Let me just go down to it and make sure it's on this. I got to open one more note here. Right here, which this is good. All right, you see these massive ages. You gotta remember this as I put this out. You gotta remember this as we put this out. Watch what it says here. The Earth's rocks can absorb a shocking amount of carbon. So remember that. And remember this. Right? That's what they talk about. You've been alive since you've been alive, right? approximately 8% of your body is made of carbon atoms. So that's very important. So just understand when we say this, is that a lot of the earth, right? Carbon and they say this born from stars, but carbon is essentially from all forms of life. And so it may be surprising that more than 90% of the Earth's carbon is underground. So carbon is actually underground. And we talked about this before, that as the volcanoes exploded and went into the air, that carbon, we know that the human body actually absorbs a lot of that carbon. And as that stuff was shooting in the air, that would increase a lot of different things that's being dated. So we got to be careful when going about carbon dating or dating these things. So we got to be careful when you start seeing things that's talking millions and thousands of years. Necessarily, we got to look at it at a totality, just like how we put it all on the map. If we look at it in a totality, what does the picture show us more? Does it show us more of a picture of what the world's painting, or does it show us the biblical narrative? Are we seeing an out of Africa concept, or are we seeing the biblical narrative? That's what we're seeing. We're rather seeing the biblical narrative than a out of Africa concept separate from what the Bible is saying. We don't see something separate from what the Bible is saying. We're seeing a hermetic picture of what the biblical narrative is saying that is actually structuring these things. And we'll talk about that. We'll talk about how these families are different but have interesting ties. We'll talk about how these families are different but have interesting ties. So always consider that when we think about carbon dating, there's a lot of stuff that goes into carbon dating and other dating, is that it can be off. And we got evidence that carbon doubled multiple times throughout the world. Multiple times. It doubled throughout multiple times throughout the world. So that's something that's important to know. So with that, family, that's all I got for now. This note will be in the description, and I'll make sure I add this note afterwards to the little video. And you can have this little picture that we're going to keep on expanding on and keep on making a clear picture, so that anytime you ever, what's the word I'm looking for? You ever need a picture or something to remind you of the biblical narrative or evidence of the biblical narrative, this is fossils that we're seeing here. This here is actually fossils that we're seeing here. Evidence of the most, and only BC. Everything on here is only BC fossils. So with that, family, may you be blessed. May you be beloved.